We're now at the Charleston Navy Yard in a building which houses the CSS Hunley, the first submarine ever to sink an enemy warship during wartime. This is a fascinating story, and one that's personal to me because my great-grandfather was involved in this attack.
My personal favorite section of Charleston is along the Battery. This is where the richest merchants of the city built their mansions. The architectural detail as well as the pastel colors of these homes are breathtaking. After the fall of Fort Sumter in 1861, the Union decided to blockade Charleston's harbor with a fleet of U.S. warships. This put a great burden on the Southern war effort. H.L. Hunley built for the Confederate Navy a man-powered submarine from an old industrial boiler, and it proceeded to sink the USS Housatonic, thus being the first successful submarine attack in naval history. This life-size replica lies just outside the Charleston Museum. And what would a trip to Charleston, part of the Confederacy, be without a visit to Fort Sumter, where the Civil War began? It was April 12, 1861. Confederate forces stationed at Fort Johnson opened fire on Union troops holding Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and a terrible war, the worst in American history, began. Brigadier General Pierre Beauregard of the newly formed Confederate States of America realized that the only way to rid Fort Sumter of Union troops would be constant shelling night and day from the 4 points of the compass. So he surrounded the fort with floating batteries, stretching from Morris and Sullivan's Islands to Forts Johnson and Moultrie. The weakness of Sumter turned out to be the wooden roofs of the interior buildings, which burned and drove the defenders into submission. Let's see how this blockade of Charleston Harbor and the construction of the CSS Hunley began. After the fall of Fort Sumter in 1861, the Union decided to put a ring of ships surrounding the southern harbors of the Confederacy. This was an attempt to prevent goods and war materials from entering the South from foreign countries. The Union used warships and commandeered commercial vessels to form a cordon around the southern states. The plan worked so well that General P.G.T. Beauregard begged for a weapon that could rid Charleston Harbor of the blockade. The solution was found when H.L. Hunley, a lawyer, plantation and machine shop owner, began building a 9-man submarine in Mobile, Alabama. He used an old steel boiler, sunk the rivets to lessen drag, and installed a cranking mechanism turned by hand by a crew of 8 volunteers and 1 officer. The boat was nearly 40 feet long and used a bellows and a snorkel to bring in fresh air. The 8 crew members worked the crankshaft by hand and were able to attain a speed of 3 knots. The officer stood at the bow of the boat and could look out of a windowed turret. The boat carried a long spar protruding from the bow. This is where the torpedo was placed. It was not a torpedo as we think of one in World War II, but rather a stationary bomb which could be rammed into a ship's hull and then detonated from below. On the night of February 17, 1864, the sub set out from Sullivan's Island toward the 1,240-ton USS Housatonic. Later reports from survivors reveal that although the U.S. sailors could hear something in the water, they could see nothing. They sounded the alarm, but it was too late. The Hunley rammed the hull of the Housatonic with its harpoon torpedo, backed off, and detonated it. The Housatonic sank in minutes, killing 5 Union sailors. But the Hunley never made it back to shore and sank with all 9 men aboard. A moral, if not a numerical, victory for the South. Coming to the rescue of the sinking Housatonic was the USS Canandaigua. My great-grandfather served as a boatswain on this ship and was undoubtedly instrumental in saving the survivors. The submarine was supposed to show a blue light towards the shore if their mission was successful. Some witnesses say they saw it, but the submarine sank and all aboard perished. The Hunley was finally located on the bottom of Charleston Harbor in 1995 and was painstakingly brought to the surface in 2000. The boat was brought to the old Charleston Navy Yard, today the Warren Lash Conservation Center, for further study. Visitors are welcome here to see the ongoing archaeological study of the Hunley. Because of my great-grandfather's part in this story, I traveled down to Charleston to do this video. The life-size model that you see here was manufactured, as I have been told, for a Hollywood movie called The Hunley, with Armand Assante and Donald Sutherland. It is a fairly accurate representation of the actual sub. I think the holes you see in the right side of the boat were for the movie cameras to poke through. The crew sat or stood and maneuvered the crankshaft by hand to propel the boat. And so a crew began doing an archaeological investigation inside the Hunley in a huge workroom at the Warren Lash Conservation Center. This would turn out to be a very long and difficult process, as the sub was filled with over 100 years of sediment from Charleston Harbor. I was given special permission to video here. We see here, from a live video camera used at the site, that the conservators scratched away at the sediment layer by layer and carefully washed and then wrapped anything found for further scrutiny. It took not weeks or months, but years to finish this work.
It's also the last position for a crewman aft in the submarine. This would be probably the second officer.
Bob, is the skull is still in the sub now?
We've taken very few bones out at this point.
Right.
We're still in the process of photographing them and mapping them, and then having Doug Owsley forensics person to, forensic anthropologist to describe
the relative position of the skull that gives you any clue as to the final moments on the ship?
No, I mean, the process that, the body decomposes.
Right.
It may, be evidenced in the positions of all the bones there, but I don't think you can, you can determine from the position of the skull where
Sure.
The individual is. Now, what we can determine, I think, is that so far what we've seen strong indications that every crewman was in his station in the submarine.
No hair? Yeah.
No, we have found hair, but usually we find it in our civet. The human hair seems to preserve very well in here. A lot of it seems it's reddish in color, but that doesn't mean all the crewmen were redheads. I think in the process of the hair degrading, I'm told that we found recently, late yesterday afternoon, the first human skull. We've also found in the same area that the skull came from, we found a shoe. Actually, we found two shoes. We've recovered one of those shoes. I found a pipe, tobacco pipe. It still seems to have a substance in it, which may very well be tobacco. It looks like it's a briar pipe. We found a nub of a pencil, a lead pencil, just like people would use today. But it seems to only be just down to a nub, like an inch long. But it does have a sharpened point. And we think, too, in the forward compartment, under the snorkel box, the breathing apparatus.
If they turn out to be bellows and he was at his duty station and that was what he was doing, it might provide some clue as to whether or not the submarine was struggling to get oxygen or was in the process of sinking. Something, whatever occurred, appears to have occurred rather quickly, the final moment.
Would you know from the clothing whether they were dressed warmly or being in the winter, or was it hot down there? Would they dress sparsely?
From what we've seen so far, the suggestion is they probably had their uniforms with them. At this point, it's too early to say anything. I think about the quality of the clothing. I think some of what we've seen. Mary Ballard from the Smithsonian is a textile conservator that's been helping us out. I think she did mention that some of the clothing looked to be more like a homespun, a plain clothing. But I would say from what we've seen of the buttons, they're artillery buttons, and then some buttons with a naval insignia. That that certainly at least two of these men had their uniforms with them.
On April 17, 2004, the remains of the Hunley crew were given a hero's burial. 3 of the crew's descendants were in attendance. And after 140 years, the Confederate States of America said goodbye to its last veterans. And so, after 12 years of painstaking work, consisting of removing layer upon layer of silt from the harbor, the Hunley has finally given up its secrets. Forensic investigation continues upon the artifacts gleaned from the wreckage. The hull stands proud as a monument to the forward-looking inventors of the Hunley. 21 Confederate crewmen and 5 Union sailors died because of this venture. But it introduced the world to a new dawn of warfare. If you are ever in the Charleston area, be sure to take a tour of the Warren Lash facility.